March 1970, West Germany, the Fulda Gap. A narrow corridor of flat farmland and gentle hills running between the East German border and Frankfurt. NATO planners had studied it for 20 years. Soviet tank commanders had memorised every road, every bridge, every choke point. Both sides understood that if a Third World War ever began in Europe, it would almost certainly begin here. Captain James Holt of the British Army of the Rhine stood in a muddy field and stared east through his binoculars. The border was 4 miles away. On the other side of that invisible line, 27 Soviet divisions sat waiting. 50,000 tanks, 1 million soldiers, enough firepower to reach the Rhine in 72 hours if the order was ever given. Holt knew the numbers. Every NATO officer did. They had been told those numbers in briefings and war games and classified reports until the figures felt like part of their blood. What he didn't know, what nobody in NATO fully understood yet, was that the enemy they had spent 20 years preparing to fight was not quite the enemy they thought they knew. That was about to change. The operation that revealed it was called Exercise Certain Shield. It was not a battle. No shots were fired. Nobody died. But what NATO intelligence officers discovered over the course of 6 weeks in the spring of 1970 rewrote everything Western military planners believed about Soviet doctrine, Soviet tactics, and Soviet soldiers. And the implications shocked people all the way to Washington and London. To understand what happened, you need to understand what NATO believed going into that year. The Soviet threat as Western planners saw it was simple and terrifying in equal measure. Mass. Overwhelming, industrial, unstoppable mass. Soviet doctrine was built on the idea that you did not need to be clever if you were big enough. You massed armour, you overwhelmed defensive lines, you accepted casualties on a scale that would have broken any Western army, and you kept pushing. It had worked against the Nazis, it would work against NATO. Western strategists called it the steamroller. Soviet forces would come in waves. The first wave would absorb NATO fire and die. The second wave would absorb more fire and die. By the third and fourth wave, NATO ammunition would be running low, NATO soldiers would be exhausted, and the sheer weight of Soviet numbers would break through. To fight this, NATO had spent the 1950s and 1960s building a doctrine of flexible response. Nuclear weapons sat at the back of every calculation. If Soviet conventional forces threatened to overwhelm NATO defences, tactical nuclear weapons would be used to stop them. This was the plan. Everybody accepted it. Everybody trained around it. There was just one problem. Nobody had actually tested whether the assumptions underneath all of it were correct. Exercise Certain Shield was supposed to be a routine NATO training exercise. British, American, and West German forces would defend a simulated Soviet assault across the inter-German border. The exercise would last 6 weeks. After it ended, commanders would write their reports and move on. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual expected. What nobody expected was Major David Caro. Caro was a British intelligence officer attached to NATO's Northern Army Group headquarters. He was 41 years old, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who read footnotes in reports that other officers skimmed. Before the exercise began, Caro made a request that his superiors considered slightly eccentric. He wanted permission to treat the exercise not just as a training event, but as an intelligence collection opportunity. He wanted dedicated teams observing and documenting every element of how opposing forces performed. He wanted everything recorded: response times, decision cycles, communication patterns, the gap between when orders were given and when units actually moved. He wanted to measure not just what forces did, but how long it took them to do it and why. His immediate superior approved the request mainly because it seemed harmless. Caro was given a small team of 6 analysts and told to get on with it. What those 6 analysts documented over the following 6 weeks changed how NATO thought about the Soviet threat for the rest of the Cold War. The exercise began on a Tuesday morning in March. West German Panzer Grenadiers held defensive positions along a ridgeline, while American armour sat in reserve and British infantry secured the flanks. The attacking force, NATO units dressed and equipped to simulate Soviet tactics, advanced according to standard Soviet doctrine: mass, speed, pressure on a narrow front. The defenders absorbed the first push and fell back to prepared secondary positions exactly as they had trained to do. Routine, by the book. But Caro's team was watching something different. They were watching not the attacking force but the defenders themselves, and what they saw was not reassuring. The first problem was time. When the simulated Soviet assault shifted direction unexpectedly, moving around the northern flank rather than pressing through the centre as anticipated, the NATO defensive response was slow. Not because the soldiers were incompetent, not because they lacked courage or training, but because the decision cycle to reposition forces required authorization from 3 separate headquarters. Each headquarters needed to consult, confirm and relay orders. By the time the repositioning was approved and executed, the simulated Soviet advance had already exploited the gap. Caro recorded the time between the flank movement being spotted and NATO forces actually beginning to reposition. It was 4 hours and 20 minutes. In real combat against actual Soviet armour, 4 hours and 20 minutes was a catastrophe. He wrote nothing dramatic in his notes. He simply wrote the number down, circled it, and began watching for the next problem. The second problem was worse. On the 4th day of the exercise, a simulated communications breakdown was introduced. This was standard practice in NATO war games. Assume the enemy will try to jam your radios, assume forward headquarters might be destroyed, test how well units can operate independently when normal communication chains break. Down. What Caro documented was a near collapse of coordinated action. British units, trained in their own operational procedures, responded with reasonable flexibility. Junior officers made local decisions and maintained defensive coherence. American units performed similarly, individual commanders showing initiative when communications failed. But the multinational coordination that NATO doctrine depended on fell apart within hours. Units that were supposed to support each other could not agree on what was happening because they had different procedures for assessing and reporting the same situation. A German battalion reported a simulated Soviet breakthrough at grid reference 1 set of coordinates. A British liaison officer at the same location reported the same breakthrough using entirely different reporting language. An American staff officer, trying to reconcile the 2 reports and allocate reserve forces, spent 47 minutes working out that they were describing the same event, 47 minutes, while 2 armoured divisions sat waiting to be committed. Caro did not raise the alarm. He did not write urgent messages to his superiors. He wrote down the time, wrote down the circumstances, and kept watching. By the end of the 3rd week, his team had accumulated a document that was uncomfortable reading. The picture that emerged was not of a NATO alliance incapable of defending Western Europe. The individual units were good. The soldiers were well trained. The equipment was effective. The problem was the architecture sitting above all of it. The command structures, the communications procedures, the decision-making chains had been designed for a world where armies had time to think. The Soviet doctrine NATO was supposed to be defending against did not give armies time to think. It was specifically designed to generate speed, confusion, and decision paralysis in the opponent. The steamroller was not just about mass. It was about moving faster than the defender could react. Caro wrote in his final report that NATO's current command structure would give Soviet commanders precisely the decision paralysis they needed to exploit a breakthrough before reserves could be committed. He had numbers to prove it. Average decision cycle time in a static defensive situation was 2 hours and 14 minutes from threat identification to force redeployment. In a fast-moving fluid situation with communications degraded, that time stretched to between 4 and 7 hours. Soviet armoured doctrine assumed NATO reaction times in exactly that range. The steamroller had been calibrated against NATO's actual weaknesses with disturbing precision. The report went up the chain of command and created a reaction that surprised Caro. He had expected it to be filed, noted, partially acted upon, the usual fate of intelligence assessments that delivered inconvenient conclusions. Instead, it reached the desk of General Andrew Moore, commander of the British Army of the Rhine. Moore read it twice. Then he made 3 phone calls and arranged a meeting with his American and West German counterparts. The meeting lasted 9 hours. What emerged from it was the beginning of what would later be called the Mission Command Revolution. The realization that NATO's rigid top-down command structure needed to be fundamentally reformed, that junior commanders needed the authority and the training to make decisions without waiting for approval from above, that the doctrine of detailed orders needed to give way to a doctrine of intent, tell a soldier what needs to be achieved and trust him to figure out how, rather than specifying every step and leaving him helpless the moment circumstances changed. None of this happened overnight. Institutional change in large militaries moves at a pace that would frustrate anyone accustomed to urgency. It took years. It took further exercises, further uncomfortable reports, arguments between generals, disagreements between allies about whose doctrine was correct and whose needed to change. But the process had begun, and it had begun because one quiet British intelligence officer, with permission from his superiors to watch carefully, had actually watched carefully. Caro himself never became famous. His name does not appear in most histories of NATO's Cold War development. The report he wrote in 1970 was declassified only in 1994, and even then attracted little attention outside specialist military circles. He retired in 1981. He went back to a small house in Wiltshire. He grew vegetables. He occasionally gave talks at staff colleges when asked. When a journalist interviewed him in 1997 about exercise Certain Shield and what it had revealed, Caro sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea and answered, carefully. He said he had not set out to prove that NATO was failing. He had simply wanted to measure what was actually happening, rather than what the doctrine said should be happening. He said that militaries had a tendency to plan and train and brief until they had convinced themselves that the plan was the reality. The exercise had just been an opportunity to check whether the two things actually matched. They had not matched. That was all. The journalist asked if he thought his report had changed anything. Caro looked out his kitchen window for a moment. Then he said that the British Army's approach to command in the Falklands in 1982 was different from the approach he had documented in 1970. Different in ways he recognised. He did not take credit for the difference. He simply observed that it existed. He died in 2004. His obituary in the local paper mentioned that he had served in the army. It did not mention what he had discovered during 6 weeks in West Germany in the spring of 1970. The broader lessons from Certain Shield eventually became NATO doctrine. Mission command, the principle that commanders at every level must understand the intent of their superiors and have the authority to act on their own judgment to achieve it, became the foundational concept of how Western armies fight. It shapes training today. It shapes how British, American and German commanders approach every operation, from collective defence exercises in Eastern Europe to deployments in active theatres. The idea that commanders should be trusted to think rather than simply to follow is not new. It was present in German military theory from the 19th century. But for NATO in the Cold War years, it required someone to sit in a muddy West German field with a notebook and prove, with numbers, that the current approach was not working. The Soviets had designed their doctrine to exploit exactly the weakness Caro had identified. The question NATO planners had failed to ask was not how many tanks the Soviet Union had, or how fast their armour could move, or how many divisions they could put into the Fulda Gap. Those numbers were known. The question they had failed to ask was whether NATO's own command structure was fast enough to use the forces it had. The answer, in the spring of 1970, was no. The answer, by the early 1980s, was beginning to change. That change did not come from a dramatic battle, from a decisive victory or a hard-learned catastrophe. It came from an exercise, from 6 weeks of careful observation, from one man writing down numbers and circling the ones that told a story nobody wanted to hear. The operation that shocked NATO soldiers was not an enemy attack. It was a mirror. And what NATO saw when it looked into that mirror was uncomfortable enough to force a generation of reform that fundamentally altered how Western armies prepared for war. Understanding how to fight matters, but understanding honestly whether you actually can is something different entirely. And that second question is always the harder one to ask. Most armies never ask it properly. They train according to the doctrine they already have, grade themselves against the standards they already accept, and report upwards that everything is functioning as intended. The gap between what the plan says and what soldiers on the ground actually experience stays invisible, because nobody's given permission to look for it. Caro had been given that permission. He had used it. And in doing so, 6 quiet weeks in the West German countryside turned out to matter more than any number of impressive exercises where everybody performed exactly as expected and learned almost nothing at all. If you made it this far, you already know. This channel is not about the famous battles or the household names. It is about the stories that get left out, the ones that changed history quietly, without anyone noticing at the time. If that is the kind of history you want more of, hit the subscribe button now. It costs you nothing, and it means you will not miss the next one. And if this video made you think, If it told you something you did not know before, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who would never have found it otherwise. There is a new video coming very soon. Until then, thank you for watching.